Good afternoon. I'm Susie Greenberg. Welcome again to today's Lessons of the Holocaust. So honored to have Kristen Thompson again facilitating today's lesson, which is about rescue and resistance. Today we will examine the various forms of rescue and resistance during the Holocaust and explore how they were possible. Quickly before we get started, I just want to bring to your attention again two upcoming programs that we will put a link in the chat for. One is today. It is going to be about the Kristallnacht, and it will be featuring Professor Wolf Gruner. Again, that link will be in the chat. And another upcoming one on November 17th, which is an interdisciplinary panel discussion for teachers about how history, communication studies, psychology, and law approach Holocaust studies. So without any further ado, we'll have Kristen start again. As per usual, we will have questions and answers afterwards. Please utilize the chat with questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Susie. It's great to be with all of you. And if you're just joining us for the first time today, welcome to you as well. And I think we're going to have time left over for questions today. That's my goal. So if you do have questions, please make sure you utilize the chat for that. Like Susie said, we're going to talk about rescue and resistance today. There tends to be this myth that Jews jumped willingly to their death during the Holocaust, like slaughter, and that is just simply not true. So that's what we're going to look at today and what we're going to explore. There are several ways in which European Jews resisted of Nazi aggression and persecution during the Holocaust. So this is just sort of an intro to the different topics we're going to cover in today's session. So first of all, we have spiritual resistance, and it refers to more than even just what we might think of as religious or spiritual. It refers to an attempt to maintain humanity and personal integrity, dignity, a sense of civilization in the face of these Nazi attempts to dehumanize and degrade people. The Nazis forbid religious services in most of the ghettos. So many of the Jews prayed and held ceremonies in secret. Maybe it was in the cellars, in attics, in back rooms, while others would stand. In Warsaw alone, in 1940, there were 600 Jewish prayer groups that existed. The prayer groups helped to sustain morale. They reaffirmed a culture and religious identity, and it supplied spiritual comfort as well. The photo that you see there is a gentleman by the name of Max Veramor. He's lighting Hanukkah candles in his internment camp in 1941. This was the last photo taken of Max prior to his deportation, where he perished in 1943. Sabotage efforts included maybe dismantling railroad tracks to stop troops and supplies. Munitions factories were producing faulty shells. So there are a number of different ways that people are also sabotaging efforts, and we'll get into a few of those examples. Aid was another form of resistance. This included providing fake identity papers, perhaps food, hiding places, taking in children, like you see in the kinder transport here. And often this aid was provided at great risk to the person who was assisting. Then obviously rescue, and this was carried out by individuals and organizations, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And Yad Vashem, of course, honors those who saved Jews as righteous among nations, and we'll explore a couple of different examples of that as well. The last one is probably what most people think of when you hear the word resistance, but this was by far the most difficult during the Holocaust. Even so, there were as many as 20,000 Jewish partisans who fought against the Nazis from bases that they established behind the front lines, either in forests or in the ghettos. Resistance was not easy. There were several obstacles to this resistance. One was simply the superior armed power that they were up against. Poland was overrun in just a matter of weeks. France fell 6 weeks later. If powerful nations couldn't resist this onslaught of Nazi occupation, then the outlook for these unarmed civilians was not good. And of course, we have to remember the anti-Jewish laws and decrees that were being passed at this time as well. And part of that was completely disarm the Jewish people so that they would have more difficulty fighting back. So in 1933, we have the disarmament of Jews beginning with weapons raids. In 1936, they're forbidden to have a firearm license, and in 38, they're forbidden from owning a firearm. Many of them still found ways to hide firearms or to get them later, but this was certainly an obstacle to the armed resistance. There's also this idea of collective responsibility that the Nazis were utilizing. So these are just 3 out of the thousands of examples that could be talked about. But basically, if one Jewish person or a small group resisted and fought back, then the remaining people would be held responsible for those actions. So for instance, in Białystok, Poland, the Nazis shot 120 people after one Nazi police officer was shot. And this is the picture of them rounding them up and taking them out into the forest to shoot them. At Treblinka, in Poland, the camp guards shot 26 Jews before prisoners managed to escape after a revolt there. And in Bakula, Poland, Nazis executed 51 Jews after there was an attack on a German police station by the members of the underground. So knowing that this was a Nazi policy, you knew that if you attempted to escape or fight back, other innocent people most likely would be held accountable for your actions. And this also weighed very heavily on the people wanting to resist. So that was certainly an obstacle for them as well. There were also penalties for hiding or aiding the Jewish people. So anybody caught hiding them or helping them, including things like providing transportation for them, buying valuables from them so that perhaps they would then have money that they could bribe somebody to try to provide hiding for them, providing them with food, etc. Any of these forms of help and aid could actually be cause for being sentenced to death. And because of this, the Jewish people had difficulty finding hiding places, food, a sympathetic local population that was willing to risk their own safety in favor of assisting the Jews. Additionally, it might not be quite so easy to blend in. Part of this was because of different languages and dialects. So if they were trying to pass themselves off as a non-Jew, depending on where you were from and your dialect, if they asked you for your papers, et cetera, and you had to speak with them, that dialect or language difference might actually give you away. There were also religious customs, physical markings such as circumcision for males, and Nazis actually did check this, and be difficult for the men in the population to try and pass themselves off as a non-Jew if they had been circumcised. It was very difficult to also get identification papers falsified. There were certain stamps that you needed, and so it was hard to come by those things. And the photo you see here was from Jean Demon's group of children. Memorizing these details of a false identity, especially for children, could be very difficult. So once again, that provided obstacles to resisting as well. And the last obstacle that we're going to talk about is also the secrecy and the deception regarding the deportations. Many of the victims did not know where they were being sent. Again, we're always looking at this history through hindsight, and so we know the end of how this is going to turn out. The people living through it at that time had no idea. So there were rumors definitely of these death camps, and those rumors were fairly widespread. But because there was no precedence for these terrible actions, planned annihilation of an entire population, and that this is now government policy, it was really too terrible for people to believe. They really passed it off to being simply rumors. Victims were told to pack some of their belongings, reinforcing this belief that they're simply going to be resettled elsewhere. And they knew that the Nazis wanted them out of Germany, so they assumed that, yes, they're going to be sent away someplace. They're given a packing list to know exactly what they're supposed to bring. And then they're receiving postcards like this one that you see here on the screen. Deportees at Auschwitz were forced to write postcards to friends and relatives who were still back either in their communities or in the ghettos by that time, telling them that they had arrived safely at this resettlement place, that they're doing well, they have work, etc. So this furthered that belief by those still in the ghettos that they would simply be relocated. And so if you're thinking, well, I'm going to be sent away, but I'll still be with family, I'll find a job, things will be better in this other place where they're sending me, that would also be an obstacle to really wanting to resist. So for the people who did resist, like we said, spiritual resistance was a way to maintain humanity and dignity. And it definitely was religious, but there were other forms that it took as well. The Jews in the ghettos and the camps responded to Nazi oppression with various forms of the spiritual resistance. They made conscious attempts to preserve the history and communal life of the Jewish people despite the Nazi efforts to eradicate them from human memory. So this might mean creating Jewish cultural institutions within the ghettos and even in the camps, continuing to observe the religious holidays and rituals, providing clandestine education for the children, publishing underground newspapers, and collecting and hiding documentation. So one example that we have of trying to maintain this humanity and dignity was to document what was happening so that the world would know. The secret archives of the Warsaw Ghetto were organized by one of the Jewish people who was being held there, who was actually an historian by trade. His name was Emanuel Ringelblum, and the organization was known by its code name, Oneg Shabbat, which means joy of the Sabbath. The term, which refers to the traditional Sabbath gathering of members of the community, was applied to their archives because all the organizers were holding this regular clandestine secret meeting on the Sabbath. It began mostly as just a chronicle by Ringelblum in October of 1939, but it transformed into an organized underground operation with several dozen contributors after the ghetto became sealed off in November of 1940. Their main objective was to document the events that were transpiring in the ghetto and in occupied Poland in general. So they included things like very descriptive reports. They had summaries of oral testimony. They kept minutes of their meetings. They had diary entries, newspaper articles, and German proclamations. And they were putting all of these documents into containers like you see here. The holdings of the archives were actually buried in 3 separate parts. The first set of documents was placed in 10 tin boxes, like the 3 that you see there, by a teacher, Israel Lichtensteins, and 2 of his former students. On August 3rd of 1942, the boxes were buried in a bunker beneath where the former public school had been, where he had taught. In February of 43, Ringelblum and Lichtensteins, the teacher, placed the second part of the archives in 2 large milk cans like the one you see here, and they buried them beneath the same building. On April 18th of 1943, so a couple months later, just one day before the start of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the third and final part of the archives was placed in a cylindrical metal box, and it was buried beneath Swirzerska Street, a building that was located there. After the war, 2 of the 3 caches of documents were recovered. There were only 2 members who survived from the Oneg Shabbat staff, and they led members of the Jewish Historical Commission of Poland to the first burial site. The 10 metal boxes were recovered in September of 1946. The second portion, the milk cans, were discovered in 1950. The final cache was never found. These were opened, and at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC, there's actually one of the milk cans that is on display there. Inside these containers, many of the people included their last will and testament, and it included this particular excerpt from David Graber. He was one of the students that was helping the teacher. And he said, "What we were unable to cry and shriek out to the world, we buried in the ground. I would love to see the moment in which the great treasure will be dug up and scream the truth at the world, so the world may know all. So the ones who did not live through it may be glad, and we may feel like veterans with medals on our chests. May the treasure fall into good hands. May it last into better times, and may it alarm and alert the world." And like I said, that particular milk can and actually his last will and testament are on display at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. So I think his wish of may it fall into good hands definitely happened, and that people do know what took place and that he is not forgotten. And so again, this was one way of resistance, was to simply tell their story, to document what was happening to them so that the world would know. Another form of resistance, as we said, was sabotage. And so for those of you who joined us for the collaboration and complicity session, you'll remember we talked about Oskar Schindler and how he's a very complicated man. He was at one time a collaborator, but he was also a rescuer. And so one of the sabotage efforts was taking place at his munitions factory. Through his plant in Brunlitz, it was classified as an armaments factory, but it produced only 1 wagon load of live ammunition for the entire 8 months of operation that they were doing. He presented falsified production figures in order to justify the camp's existence, and therefore he could keep some of the Jewish people working in his factory. But he didn't want to be, responsible for taking any more lives, and so they were making sure the amount of powder going into the shells was not enough. It was always miscalibrating so that they would not actually work when they were used by the troops. This facilitated the survival of over 1,000 Jews, sparing them the horrors and brutality of conventional camp life, being able to stay in Oskar Schindler's. On May 9th, 1945, Schindler left Brunlitz, and that was the day that the Soviet troops liberated the camp. So he stayed with them until the very end. We're going to listen to Lugmilla as she talks about the sabotage process at the munitions factory. Sorry. I apologize. I'm not sure what happened. There we go.
Well, there was no safety under German occupation. There was no safety because these people they were torturers, murderers. There was no logic in it, no reason in it. This was just pure hatred and pure murder all the time. But Schindler assumed that if his workers will work for the war effort, and he changed it in Brunlitz, he changed his production to production of shells from enamelware, because he had to prove really, because they arrested him twice because they didn't think that he was working for the war effort and so on. So we were doing, making shells, and we were supposed to polish these shells, but all the production was faulty because we on purpose were sabotaging this, they were never as they ought to be, always was something flawed in those shells during our months in Brunlitz. And this is how he could save us, proving that his factory was indispensable for the war effort.
So a little bit of backstory about Lugmilla. It's actually quite interesting about she and her husband. She was born into an assimilated Jewish family in Romania. Her mother was a physician, and the two were living in Poland when the Germans invaded in September of 1939. Her husband, Leopold, had earned his master's degree from the university in philosophy and physical education, and he taught at the high school until the start of World War II, when the Germans closed all of the Jewish schools. He then had to do the forced labor for the Germans, building roads, etc. Leopold and Lugmilla were married on July 7th in 1940, and they were forced into the Krakow ghetto in March of 41. Her mother was sent to the Warsaw ghetto, so they had split at that point. 2 years later, in March of 43, Leopold and Lugmilla were sent to Plaszow labor camp. Leopold was then transferred to Gross-Rosen concentration camp, and Lugmilla was transported to Auschwitz in November of 1944. She remained in Auschwitz weeks until Oskar Schindler personally intervened to transfer a group of about 300 women to his new plant in Brunlitz in Czechoslovakia, where she was reunited with Leopold. Lugmilla and Leopold continued to work for Oskar Schindler until their liberation by the Soviet Army on May 8th of 1945. Liberation, Leopold spent several weeks recuperating from dysentery in Brunlitz. After he recovered, they could go to Palestine. And if you remember the difficulties we talked about with immigration and how long it could take these kinds of things, they kept staying in Budapest for 3 months, but they were unsuccessful getting all of the paperwork together in order to depart for Palestine. So finally, they decided to really go to the zone of occupation in Germany in December of 45. They lived in Munich for about a year and a half while they waited for their papers to emigrate to the US. In April of 47, they left for New York with the assistance of the Joint Distribution Committee. They stayed in New York until 1950, and eventually they moved to Beverly Hills, where Leopold opened a leather goods store. All of Leopold and Lugmilla's immediate family perished in the Holocaust. His parents were killed in 41 or 42. His sister and her husband were caught with false papers, and they were arrested and executed in a Warsaw prison. Lugmilla believes her mother was killed eventually in 1942 in Belgium. And Leopold lost about 100 members of his extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, etc. He constantly pitched the idea of a book about Oskar Schindler because he was so impressed with how Oskar Schindler was able to save people. And of course, losing the rest of his family just made that point even more poignant. So everybody that he came across, he kept trying to tell them about what Oskar Schindler had done for them, and thinking that the story needed to get out, he was trying to convince somebody to write a story about it, write a book. One day, an Australian author, Thomas, happens to come into his leather goods store in Beverly Hills, and Leopold is telling him about Oskar Schindler, the book, and it's published in '82, becoming an international bestseller. And eventually, Leopold is the one who actually talked to Steven Spielberg to direct the movie based on the book. So it's interesting that they have such a connection and were so influential in telling that story and bearing witness so the rest of us would know what exactly had transpired. Another example of sabotage takes place in Norway at a heavy water plant. The mission was to blow up a heavy water plant in Norway, helping to sabotage Hitler's nuclear program. Lieutenant Joachim Ronenberg, a 23-year-old Norwegian resistance fighter, was in command, and his 8 Norwegian comrades were with him. They all carried cyanide capsules to swallow in case they were captured. They had been told by the British intelligence, who had been the ones training them, only that this plant was distilling something called heavy water, but they didn't really know what that was. They just knew that it was vital to Hitler's war effort. And just to go back a little bit about the occupation of Norway to make this story have a little bit of context for you. On April 8th and 9th in 1940, Germany invaded Norway. Germany sought to secure some naval bases to use against the British fleet to guarantee the vital iron ore ships out of neutral Sweden. Norway had surrendered to Germany on June 10th in 1940, and the King Haakon VII, and the Norwegian government escaped to London. By 42, the British knew that Germany had chosen heavy water, or deuterium oxide, for those of you who maybe are scientists, I am not, but this was to moderate the atom splitting chain reactions that produces bomb-grade plutonium. They knew further that the Norsk Hydro plant in Norway, which had been extracting this heavy water since 1934 for making fertilizer, had been taken over upon Nazi occupation of Norway, and was Germany's best hope for completing their atomic weapons program. There was actually a race to win the atomic bomb facilitation, I guess. The production of the heavy water sharply increased at this plant, and this was something that was noted by resistant informers who were working inside the plant, and it caused a great deal of alarm once it was reported back to London. There was an earlier attempt to take out this plant as well. 35-man British commando team had been killed during a 1942 mission to sabotage the plant. There were 2 bombers that were towing gliders like you see in this photo. They towed them all the way to Norway. They hit some very rough weather along the way, and suffering from both the long trip and this bad weather, the first bomber released its glider, but then the bomber crashed into the mountains. Nobody from the bomber survived, and the glider also lost control, crash landed, but there were some people who survived. The second bomber had trouble finding the landing site, and they chose to just abort the mission. But as the glider turned to leave, the tow rope had broken, and it left the second glider crash land as well. There were survivors from that crash also. Those who survived the crash landings might have preferred an instant death, however, because the Germans ended up marching them through the cold, then interrogated them, tortured them, and eventually did kill them. The Germans knew about the Allied interest in this plant. In fact, they'd even secured maps and plans for the attack in the wreckage from the gliders. Using that information, they fortified their security around the plant to include landmines, floodlights, and they increased the number of troops that would be around for security of the plant. Britain then enlisted these Norwegian volunteers for a second attempt taking on this plant. This was under Mr. Ronenberg, and it was called Operation Gunnerside. Air attacks were not going to be ordered because there was a fear of heavy casualties to the Norwegian workers, and also there was a low probability of success because the heavy water had been distilled in the basement of the plant, and the basement had been fortified against bombs. So they really needed for people to get inside and take them out themselves personally. So Operation Gunnerside is born. It's a secret ops mission that's actually going to take place on skis in February of 1943. Since the bombers and the gliders didn't work out, they decide instead that they're going to parachute in and then they'll ski to where this plant is. So they trained in Britain. The group parachuted into Norway under the cover of snowfall at around midnight on February 16th of 1943. But there was a pretty bad snowstorm, and so they landed miles from their planned target site. They eventually find their way to an abandoned mountain cabin, and they hold up there until the storm passes. The blizzard stalled them for about a week. Finally, they move out, and they actually ski at night across the Telemark pine forest in their winter white camouflage, as you see in the photo. They then reach the gorge where the Veramor hydro plant was located late on the night of February 27th, 1943. The power plant was perched on a ledge halfway up a far slope, and there were steep slopes on either side plunging about 1,000 feet to the Mana River below. This maybe gives you a better idea of where the plant is and just how difficult it was going to be to access it. There was going to be no easy way in. There were 3 different ways that they could choose to access the plant. They could come down from the mountains above the plant, but this was now covered in minefields because of the first attempt that had failed, and they knew that now the Allies were onto the plant. So that's where they put the minefields. They could cross a heavily guarded single-lane suspension bridge, which you see the photo in the upper right-hand corner. And because that was guarded, it was going to be very difficult to cross that. So their third choice is actually the one that they went with. They would travel to the bottom of the gorge, cross a half-frozen river, and then climb up the icy cliff. One man from the group was designated to break off from the team to maintain radio contact with London, and the other set off to the plant with explosives, fuses, Tommy guns, grenades, compasses, and a pair of metal shears that Ronenberg had picked up in London at a hardware store at the last minute, and that item actually proved critical for breaking into where the hard water was stored. They also carried rations for 5 days for the escape that they were supposed to make afterwards on their skis into Sweden. And additionally, they had that cyanide capsule that we talked about. Should capture look imminent, they were supposed to take their own lives rather than be captured. Ronenberg and his team used their mountaineering skills to scale the tall cliffs that were covered in ice. Remember, they're doing this in wintertime, so the photo doesn't quite do it justice to what kind of conditions they must have encountered. Even as they carried out their attack, the Norwegian squad knew that their chance of succeeding was small and that they had little chance of actually surviving. One of the most nerve-wracking moments, he later said, came after the explosives had been planted. The saboteurs had cut the time on the fuses from 2 minutes to only 30 seconds for them to escape. He wanted to be sure that they could actually hear the small explosions in the basement to know if the mission was successful. So instead of having 2 minutes to get away, he was afraid they'd be too far away and couldn't actually hear it. So 30 seconds they had, that was it to get out. They quickly scrambled out of the plant and started again to climb up now. And Ronenberg said in an interview, "We heard a tiny, insignificant pop. It was almost anticlimactic. But the explosives did their job, ruining the plant's production of the heavy water." The blast then set off an intensive search for the people responsible for it. Just above the facility, Ronenberg and his team kept climbing and creeping up the mountainside. And again, it's wintertime, it's ice covered. All along, they kept watching for a cable car like the one you see in the photo that could actually take the Germans quickly and easily up the mountain, but it never moved. And Ronenberg said, "We were scared to death. If they used the cable car, we were done for." The team had trained meticulously on the plant's layout using drawings and recreations in Britain. That practice was crucial in actually finding and destroying the specialized equipment in the plant's basement. But he says, we only had the broadest of plans for what came after. We had been ordered to head for Sweden afterwards, if there was any afterwards, he said. They ended up skiing for 2 weeks to reach Sweden, which was about 250 miles. And as they did so, they were eluding thousands of Nazi troops the entire way. Ronenberg years later actually joked with reporters and said it was the best skiing weekend of his life. The team's bravery was recognized with medals from Norway, Britain, the US, and numerous other countries as well. But when the Norwegian team carried out their mission, they only knew that it was crucial to destroy these tanks of liquid at the plant. It wasn't until the United States used atomic weapons that they really understood the nature of their operation. Ronenberg said in an interview, it was August of 1945 when the US dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then we knew what we had done had been of great importance, but not until then. Sadly, Ronenberg died in 2018 at the age of 99. Pretty incredible. As we mentioned, aid was another form of resistance as well, and this included forging documents, providing food, shelter, hiding places, and taking in children. During the Holocaust, countless Jewish organizations and individuals worldwide did what they could to help people. While these rescue efforts were often initiated by the Jews, some of them would not have been very successful without the assistance of numerous sympathetic non-Jewish people as well. And perhaps one of the most well-known efforts was that of the Kindertransport that you see pictured here. There were organized actions to rescue children that had taken place, that were starting up even before the onset of the war. There was a movement founded for the transfer of Jewish children from Germany to Palestine. Under the auspices of the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem, they managed to bring more than 14,000 unaccompanied children to Palestine and Britain between 1933 and 45. In Great Britain, there was an umbrella group known as the Movement for the Care of Children, and they organized the travel and shelter of over 10,000 Central European Jewish refugee children between December of 38 and September of 39. Since the children were traveling without their parents, the operation became known as the Kindertransport. I look at this photo of the parents waving and saying goodbye to their children. As a parent myself, I can't even imagine the choice that they were faced with, and it just breaks one's heart to think of having to send your kids away like that, not knowing if you'd ever see them again, but thinking of their safety first. So it's hard to even begin to truly comprehend what people went through. This is just one of the many, many stories from the Kindertransport, but this is Herbert K. He brought these boots that you see here with the clip-on ice skates with him when he was evacuated from Czechoslovakia on one of the Kindertransports in June of 1939. His sister Dorothea was also on the Kindertransport. He talked about his experiences later, and he said, I left Bratislava, Czechoslovakia on 28th of June, 1939. I was age 10 with 2 suitcases. Among my possessions were these boots and a pair of clip-on skates, which I never used because my feet were too big by the time winter came around and there was no ice about. He said that the skates remained in his possession until he unearthed them for this exhibition that was going to be at the Imperial War Museum in London. And he said, as I was brushing up the boots, I pondered the thought that the last time they were polished would have been by my mother in 1939. And he said that the laces were still the original too. So wanting to leave everything as it has been because that was the only item he had left that his mother had actually touched and given him. So he kept it just as it was. Both of his parents perished in 1942 at the hands of the Nazis. He had written letters to his parents that would go through Portugal, and he did this up until 1941. He wrote letters in German, Hungarian, Czech, and later on in English. After the war, Dorothea, his sister, went back to Bratislava, and she found that the letters had actually been saved by a neighbor. And so the neighbor returned them and she brought them back to Herbert. When Herbert arrived in England, he was sent to live in Glasgow with an elderly female doctor where he was not very happy. Eventually, he was sent as an evacuee to a place called Ayrshire, where he lived with the landlady of one of the local school teachers. He said that their attitude towards me was in stark contrast to that of the lady doctor, and we took to each other immediately. He said I had told him of me a sense of liberation, and for the first time since arriving in the UK, very happy. In 1945, at the end of the war, steps were taken for Herbert to be returned to Czechoslovakia, but he had no relatives left there and he could no longer speak the language. His foster family gave him a home. He was allowed to stay in the UK. In 1947, he became a citizen and completed his education. He went to university to study medicine. And that was one of the challenges that they faced with transport, is by the end of the war, even if the parents had survived, if children were quite young when they were sent away, the kids no longer knew their parents and they were strangers. Maybe they didn't know the language anymore. And so a lot of these reunions were not exactly the happy, wonderful reunions that parents had hoped that they would be if the parents were lucky enough to be some of the folks who actually survived. When Germany occupied the Netherlands, a young girl by the name of Elise went into hiding with Molly Van Heel, who was a non-Jewish friend of her mother's and Molly's husband, Jerry. Though Elise once walked in on Jerry while he was forging identification cards, it wasn't until decades later that she actually learned the full story behind the Van Heel's efforts to rescue countless Jews. So like we said, another form of aid was forging documents, but this was very difficult because you needed specific stamps in order to make that happen. So hopefully this video will work better than the last.
The Elise Kahn collection is a collection of stamps, documents, and some photographs that Elise Kahn Jaeger donated to the museum. The Kahn collection has been a great help in understanding more about resistance activities in the Netherlands. We really don't have anything this exemplary that really explains the process of forging identification cards. Elise Kahn was one of 4 children, Jewish children, living in the Netherlands when the Nazis invaded the Netherlands. Elise Kahn's mother was friends with Molly Van Heel, and Molly had approached Elise's mother and said, "You're in danger, you're Jewish, it's 1942, you really need to go into hiding and we want to help you." And Elise's mother didn't want to do that. She wasn't ready. Some time had passed, she came back and she said, "Look, you might not want to go into hiding yourself, but you have to think of your children." So she agreed to go ahead and place her children in hiding with a number of rescuers. It turned out that Elise and her sister, Judith, were in hiding with Molly Van Heel and her husband, Jerry. The Van Heels lived in Eindhoven. Philip's company was in Eindhoven, and there were people who were working in the company, and they got together as a group and they decided they needed to rescue Jews, help people, work with the resistance. And the Van Heels didn't want to do that because they didn't want to be part of a group. Nevertheless, they wanted to help. It really probably came to a head when Mrs. Van Heel, Molly Van Heel's brother, who was performing resistance activities, was arrested and was killed. And they took over her brother's efforts and continued on from there. In other countries, you have experiences where people would purchase baptismal papers or birth certificates from non-Jews and just walk into an office and have cards issued to them using that piece of paper. This is different because they were actually making the identification cards in their house, which is highly unusual because you needed the stamps. You needed a variety of devices to make it work. And they stole these things. They managed to steal these, or they worked with the underground who obtained them for them. Or Elise explained to me that Mr. Van Heel and Mrs. Van Heel also obtained some of these things from her brother, who had himself stolen some of these stamps and used some of these materials and ink bottles to forge the identification papers. The collection that Elise gave to us contains a number of blank pages, full documents. They also had a book, which was printed by the Nazis in the Netherlands, which really was interesting because it's a number by number description of every identification card that is thought to be stolen or forged. And this enabled them to also know what numbers were problematic. In addition, there were notes that Mr. Van Heel had included in the collection, which were sort of his personal notes and crib sheets as to what to do, what numbers not to use, sort of cliff notes, his cliff notes per se, as to how to create the identification card. Elise talks about one evening walking into a room that they weren't really supposed to go into, and she walked in on Mr. Van Heel, who had materials out, and only later she could surmise that he was probably forging identification cards, creating these forged papers. And she did not ask him about it, but he said to her, "Please leave and don't ever talk about this." Elise kept in touch with the Van Heels after she was liberated, and she would go back periodically to visit once she was living in the United States. And at one of these visits, she approached Mr. Van Heel and she asked him about it. And he went into the other room and he got out a box, and it was the box with the stamps, the ink, the blank pages, everything. And he explained to Elise what he was doing and what Molly was doing. By giving the artifacts to the museum, she can also tell the Van Heel story, which is for her very important. She was very close to this family. They saved her life and her sister's life, and she knows that they rescued a number of other people. So for her, it was one more way in which I think she could honor these people.
I find that story just incredible, especially when you look at that book with all the numbers that were supposedly known to the Nazis to be fake. So for them to have that is just really amazing. Each one of these stories that you start to hear individual stories about, for me, is really where the meaning is found, when you start to understand just the sacrifices that individuals made for others and the heroic deeds that they did. So this particular gentleman, Raoul Wallenberg, was a Swedish diplomat who led one of the most extensive and successful rescue efforts during the Nazi era. He worked with the War Refugee Board and is believed to have saved 100,000 Hungarian Jews. Shortly after arriving in Budapest, Hungary in July of 1944, he started distributing certificates of protection to the Jews called the Schutzpass. He was posthumously granted American citizenship in 1981. And in 1985, the portion of the street on which the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. is located was renamed in his honor. So their address is 100 Raoul Wallenberg Place Northwest. He studied in the U.S. actually at his grandfather's urging. He went to the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in the 1930s. And afterwards, he established himself in a business career in Sweden. Wallenberg was then recruited by the U.S. War Refugee Board in June of 1944 to travel to Hungary. He was given the status of a diplomat by the Swedish legation, and Wallenberg's task was to do what he could do, the best he could do, to assist and save as many of the Hungarian Jews as were left. Hungary had been an ally of Germany, of course, in the war, but the German defeats and the mounting Hungarian losses had led Hungary to seek an armistice with the Western Allies. To forestall these peace negotiations, the Nazis occupied Hungary on March 19th of 1944, and they forced the Hungarian head of state, Miklos Horthy, to appoint a pro-German government. And the pro-German government in Hungary was prepared not only to continue with the war, but also to deport the Hungarian Jews to German-occupied Poland, where the killing centers were. Shortly after the occupation, the Hungarian officials began to round up the Hungarian Jews and transfer them into German custody. By 1944, the Hungarians and the Germans had deported nearly 440,000 Jews from Hungary. Almost all of them had been sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. 320,000 of them had been killed upon arrival at Auschwitz, and the rest were put into forced labor. There were nearly 200,000 Jews who remained in Budapest, and the Hungarian authorities intended to deport them as well in compliance with the German requests. So this is Agnes, and when she was 26 years old, she was working with Raoul Wallenberg, and she has a couple of very interesting stories to tell us about Wallenberg and how he personally would intervene to help save the Jewish people.
Budapest is two cities, and in the middle is the so-called blue Danube. For me, it is the red Danube, but that's what it was. And they took people down there, the Hungarian Nazis, and they roped 3 people together, and they shot the middle one, so they all fell in. And if they saw a movement, they shot again, so that be sure. But many people by themselves somehow got out. But it was a terribly cold winter, as I said, and the Danube was frozen with big slabs of ice. So Raoul came home the 3rd night, and there was no moonlight, no stars, just cold and dark. And he turned to us the first time. Usually he only talked to the men and the Red Cross, and how many of you can swim? I have a big mouth. I put up my hand. I said, best swimmer in school. He says, let's go. And as you saw me coming in like a teddy bear, that's how I was dressed, and a hat and a glove. And we went down on the other side. The Hungarians didn't even hear us coming because they were so busy roping and shooting. And we stood on the left, way over. We had doctors and nurses in the cars, and then we had people outside to pull us out. 4 of us, 3 men and me, we jumped. And thanks to the icicles, the ropes hang on to it, and we saved people out, but only 50. And then we were so frozen that we couldn't do it anymore. But without Raoul Wallenberg, we wouldn't have saved even 1 single person.
I find it fascinating that she gives all of the credit to Wallenberg, which, yes, it was his idea, but she's the one jumping in the water to rescue those people and was doing this until she was so frozen she couldn't move anymore, and saying we only saved 50. I think that's just absolutely incredible, but that's just one of the many stories of Wallenberg and the attempts to rescue the remaining Jews in Hungary and Budapest. So with authorization from the Swedish government, he began distributing certificates, the Schutzpass, of protection that was issued by the Swedish legation to the Jews in Budapest shortly after his arrival. The W in the lower left corner indicates that Wallenberg initialed this particular document, and then you see the 3 yellow or gold crowns. That was the symbol for the Swedish government as well, for the monarchy, for the royal family. He used the War Refugee Board and Swedish funds to establish hospitals, nurseries, and a soup kitchen, and to designate more than 30 safe houses that together formed the core of what was referred to as the International Ghetto in Budapest. That idea of a safe house, though, is a bit of a misnomer because at any time the Nazis could go in, round up the people if they wanted to, but it was this idea that it was supposed to be a safe house. This so-called international ghetto was reserved for Jews and their families holding these certificates of protection from a neutral country. After the Hungarian fascist Arrow Cross movement seized the power with the help of the Germans on October 15th of 1944, the Arrow Cross government resumed the deportation of the Hungarian Jews, which Horthy had halted. As the Soviet troops had already cut off the rail transport routes to Auschwitz, because this is getting towards the end of the war, Hungarian authorities, the Arrow Cross, were forcing tens of thousands of the Budapest Jews to march west to the Hungarian border with Austria. During the autumn of 1944, Wallenberg repeatedly and often personally intervened to secure the release of those with certificates of protection or forged papers, saving as many people as he could from those marching columns. And he's the gentleman standing here in the circle with his back to us. He's got his hands clasped behind his back. And so as Adolf Eichmann was organizing these death marches of thousands of Jews to the Austrian border, Wallenberg often pursued the convoy in his car and secured the release of people with his protective passport. And we're going to hear from Agnes again as she describes what happened at one of those particular junctures.
Raoul went after these people all the way to the Austrian border. But one of these occasions, he had Paranger with him too, and he had a big black book. And on the way to the railway station, he stopped and screamed at the Nazis in German. He spoke perfect German. "How dare you are taking our people? They all are protected people. And all of those people who have my papers turn around." And there was one of my very good girlfriends from here now. She said, "Well, what can happen? They kill her anyhow." She turned around. She didn't have any paper, and her sister and her mother. And they got on the truck, okay? And then he started to open his black book and started to read names like a machine gun. And the people caught on, those who could still walk. And they walked out, whether that was their name or not. And he brought about 1,000 people back to Budapest to these safe houses. And on the way home, Paranger said to him, "Raoul, I didn't know we have a black book and you have names. When did you do that?" And Raoul started hysterically laughing. He says, "I show it to you when I've done it." And he opens it up, and not one single name. Nothing. But that was his idea. He had to do something. He had to save people. And the same thing, he had driver's licenses and insurance papers, whatever he could find in Hungarian, but the Germans couldn't read. And he took it all the way to the train, and he demanded to open the doors. And he yelled to the people, "I have your papers here. Get out, Mr. So-and-so." And there too, some people, "Oh, maybe we can get away." And he handed them, some of them got the Schutzpass, not with their name, but who cares, and insurance papers and tax papers, you name it. And he brought them back.
So for even the other people to turn around and get off of the trains and pretend that those were their papers, like she said, people also had to be thinking that, well, what's the worst that can happen? So I might as well give this a try. Pretty incredible. Well, after the liberation of Budapest, when the Soviet forces liberated Budapest in February of 45, more than 100,000 Jews remained, mostly because of the efforts of Wallenberg and his colleagues. Wallenberg was last seen in the company of Soviet officials on January 17, 1945, as the Red Army was coming in to overtake Budapest. Wallenberg tried to negotiate with the Soviets to ensure proper care for what he referred to as his Jews who remained. He felt very responsible for them. The Soviets were highly suspicious of this. Why would this Swedish person care about what happens to the Jews? And so they believed he was a spy. Wallenberg was escorted by the Soviet soldiers to meet with their officials to discuss what was going on. And he was overheard saying he did not know if he was going as their guest or as a prisoner. At that point, all trace of Wallenberg and his driver was lost. The Soviets claimed that they had no knowledge of Wallenberg. However, German prisoners of war who had returned from Soviet imprisonment testified that they had actually met Wallenberg in prisons and various camps in different parts of the Soviet Union. A Soviet government report in 1956 suggested that Wallenberg died in July of 1947 while imprisoned by Soviet authorities at the infamous Lubyanka prison in Moscow. However, there were subsequent eyewitnesses who said that they saw Wallenberg in the prisons after 1947. So they've called that statement into question. The exact date and circumstances of Wallenberg's death may never be actually known for sure. But in October of 2016, 71 years after his disappearance, Swedish officials formally declared Wallenberg legally dead. There were several honors posthumously that were awarded to him. So like we said, in 1981, in recognition of the rescue action, the US Congress awarded him honorary American citizenship. He's also honored at Yad Vashem as a righteous among nations. And as we mentioned, the address for the US Holocaust Memorial Museum is also named in his honor. And the last part that we're going to get to today, the armed resistance of the Jewish partisans. Like we said, this was the most difficult form of resistance. But despite those great obstacles, Jews thought that throughout occupied Europe attempted armed resistance against the Germans and their Axis partners. They faced overwhelming odds and in desperate scenarios, including lack of weapons and training, operating in hostile zones, had to separate often from family members to go and join the resistance, and yet thousands resisted by joining or forming partisan units. One of the partisans, Isaac Sutton, who later changes his name to Jack, gave this comment. He said, "We ranged in ages from 16 to 30. The majority were men, but there were also some women. We had no weapons except for rocks, bottles, and knives. We were completely outnumbered and surrounded by trained German military forces, supported loyally by the local population. We had no expectation we would live beyond the next few weeks or months. Why not resist when the alternative was death at a time and place chosen by the Nazis? Desperation drove us, along with revenge. Our families had been butchered and piled into nameless graves. The thought of taking a few German lives in return was a powerful incentive." It's a very interesting story about Isaac Jack Sutton. I was talking to Susie and Laura about his story, and they said, oh my goodness, they had actually featured him in an exhibition that they had done as well. So just a little bit of back information about him. Jack was born in Belarusia. He became a committed Zionist during his teenage years, and he made plans to settle in Palestine, but his papers did not come through before the German invasion. He was only 16 years old when the war started. During the first years of the war, he attended a Soviet school where he met his future wife, Rochelle. Following the German invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of '41, his family was forced into the Mir Ghetto, where he was part of the slave labor repairing roads. He and his father narrowly escaped a German action that took place in Mir in the ghetto in the fall of '41 by hiding temporarily in the home of a sympathetic Polish farmer who had been a former dental patient of his parents. Both of his parents were dentists. The remaining Jewish community was then moved into a nearby castle. Some of the younger people who were confined to the castle, many of whom were also Zionist youth members, began to plan their escape. An opportunity arose when they learned that a Jew had actually infiltrated the local German military police, and he was passing information and arms to the group. When he sent word that the liquidation of the ghetto was set for August 13th of 1942, the group set their escape for August 9th. Isaac was among the first to leave the castle. His father followed the next day. In all, there were approximately 300 Jews who succeeded in escaping from the Mir castle. Once in the forest, Isaac organized a small band of partisans. His shelter was a small bunker in which he set aside room for Rochelle. He had a premonition that she would join him, despite the fact that the two had actually lost contact. Rochelle's father had been a prosperous businessman, and her mother was a dentist. She had two younger sisters. In August of '41, when they were occupied by the SS units, they rounded up the prominent Jewish residents, including her father, and they were stoned to death in a mass grave. Rochelle was sent to work in a sawmill on the outskirts of town. In the autumn of '42, her mother and sisters were taken out of the ghetto and shot during an action which targeted the ghetto's non-working population. So all alone, she decides to flee with a girlfriend. They swam across the Niemen River and ran into the woods on the opposite shore, where they met a group of Russian partisans who agreed to shelter them in exchange for housework. The Russians, however, abused the girls, and so the two ran away again. While on the run, they met a Jewish partisan named Fanya, who belonged to Isaac's partisan unit. She told Rochelle that Isaac was expecting her because of this premonition, and she brought Rochelle to Isaac. For the rest of the war, Rochelle and Jack, Isaac, remained in the forest, where they lived in a common law marriage. They were married on New Year's Eve of 1942 among the partisans in the forest. Soon after the war, the couple was remarried in a Jewish ceremony, and they left the Soviet Union for Germany. For the next several years, they lived in a displaced persons camp, where Isaac worked as a camp administrator and a photojournalist. Their daughter, Cecilia, who's pictured on the bench with her mother, Rochelle, was born in the DP camp. The family immigrated to the United States in August of 1949. Isaac changed his name to Jack, and they settled in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. His experience, like I said, was featured as part of the JCRC's Transfer of Memory exhibit, where the current picture, the updated one of Jack, is from. Jack said of his experience, when we got together, we didn't have anyone else. She lost her family, I lost mine. We took care of each other. And so they continued to do so for 68 years of marriage until Rochelle's recent death. They were blessed with family, including children, grandchildren, and even 2 great-grandchildren. Reflecting on his experiences, Jack's message was, be happy when you have a mother and father, take good care of them. And sadly, Jack passed away in 2017. And you'll notice the photos behind him on the bookshelves are of he and Rochelle as well. And this is just a map with showing some of the areas where the partisans were active. And wow, we're out of time again. How does that always happen? I just want to leave you with this thought because this is very important. Even though today's session was only on rescue and resistance, it's important to note that the U.S. Holocaust Museum's guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust, one of them is to not romanticize the history. So people who risk their lives to rescue victims of Nazi oppression, obviously, they provide compelling role models, something we should all aspire to do. But given that a very small fraction of non-Jews under Nazi occupation actually helped rescue Jews, an overemphasis on these heroic actions can result in an inaccurate and unbalanced account of history. So we really have to remember that while these stories of rescue and resistance are very important, the number of people who actually rescued is very, very small. And so we have to keep that in mind. And I apologize for going over time. I hope you have questions. I'm happy to answer your questions in emails as well.
Thank you so much, Kristen. While people hopefully want to put some questions in the chat, I did put into the chat the address of the Transfer of Memory exhibit, so the website, so you can look at that. It's of Minnesota Holocaust survivors that Jack Sutton was a part of, that Kristen was talking about. Additionally, I also wanted to note that when she was talking about the kinder transport, the JCRC, along with Bethel Synagogue and the American Swedish Institute, is bringing an exhibit to Minnesota next summer, the end of July through the end of October. Hopefully we'll be able to be in person, all about the kinder transport. So you'll learn more about that marketing when we are getting closer, but wanted to let you know. So are there any questions for Kristen? She does a very thorough job. All right, well, feel free to ask, but thank you all for being here, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Tomorrow is on liberation and displaced persons. We'll examine personal stories of liberation, what it meant to be a displaced person, and why the Jews could not go home. We'll also discuss the Nuremberg Military Tribunal and the creation of the Jewish state of Israel. Thanks.